I wasn't looking for anything in the attic, but then I found a box that shattered everything I thought I knew about my husband. What I read inside changed my life forever. The attic felt heavy and dusty that afternoon, but I wasn't searching for anything specific. I just stumbled upon it, a plain cedar box, no bigger than a showbox, tucked behind an old inflatable Santa. It was tied tightly with a faded, almost brittle silk ribbon. My mother always warned against disturbing things that had been put away for decades, but I couldn't resist. Curiosity, that cold, sharp edge of it, was too strong. I didn't think about George. Not yet. I thought about who had hidden it. The handwriting on the first letter, sprawling and passionate, looked somehow familiar, yet utterly foreign. My breath hitched as I traced the signature, G. I dismissed it at first, a distant relative, a family friend perhaps. But as I unfolded the next letter, dated exactly 2 weeks after our elaborate, teary wedding, the details became too specific, too intimate, to ignore. My soul belongs to you, my dear, the script declared. Agnes is a duty, you are my delight. The things we build here are only foundations for the life we will finally have. That line. A duty. I read the date again, June 1995. I was pregnant with Thomas then, carrying the weight of George's supposed joy, watching him beam as he talked about our future. All the while, he was writing this, weaving a passionate counter-narrative with the woman he called his true north. The letters spanned 20 years, a relentless, parallel truth running beneath the polished surface of my life. My best friend, Elizabeth, who had died 5 years ago. Elizabeth, who had stood beside me at the altar, whose hand I held when she was ill, who had looked me in the eye and lied every single day for 2 decades. The sheer audacity of the betrayal didn't ignite rage, it sparked something far colder, a chilling, surgical detachment. The worst wasn't the physical infidelity, it was the architectural lie. George hadn't just slept with Elizabeth, he had used their secret emotional bond as the bedrock of his character, a private well of ego reinforcement that fueled his public performance as the devoted husband and pillar of the community. He excelled at the subtle, patronizing condescension, the quick, tight correction of a statistic I misstated, the dismissal of my social insights as charming knavit. He made me feel perpetually slightly less intelligent, less valuable, ensuring I never questioned his authority, especially his financial decisions which, of course, always favored his self-interest. I realize now that the subtle emotional abuse was the mechanism he used to keep the parallel life running smoothly. I remembered a small, significant incident from Christmas 3 years ago. George had insisted on buying a hideous, overpriced antique clock for the entryway, overriding my suggestion for something modern and useful. "Agnes, you don't understand the value of history," he'd said, his voice dripping with superiority. "This clock will cement our legacy." Now, staring at the damning letters, I understood the true meaning of his words. His legacy wasn't built on love or partnership, it was built on a foundation of manipulation and my family's trust fund, which he had leveraged masterfully to secure his chairmanship of the Founders' Day Gala, the event he prized above our children, above me, above everything. My first move was not to confront him. Confrontation was his element. He would deny, gaslight, and turn my anger into my instability. My revenge had to be surgical, striking at his identity, not his ego. That evening, I wore the blue velvet robe he liked, watched his favorite financial news channel with him, and moved around the kitchen with the silence of a ghost, all while a plan crystallized in my mind. I needed to ensure the humiliation was permanent, extending beyond a mere social scandal. It had to be a professional execution. The O'Connell family. They were the vultures, the ambitious, perpetually frustrated runner-ups who yearned for George's coveted chairmanship. They didn't care about morals, they cared about power. The next morning, I carefully scanned and printed the most financially damning pages, a letter where George complained about the tedious financial planning I had to handle, and how Elizabeth was the only one who truly understood his ambition. I fabricated a plausible tale that the papers were mistakenly left in a donated book. I didn't contact the O'Connells directly. Instead, I mailed a thick, anonymous envelope to Mrs. O'Connell's private office, marked urgent, committee oversight matter. I knew her greed would do the rest. I'd given his rivals the knife, and now I just had to provide the perfect stage for the murder. This secret move, executed while George was oblivious, gave me a grim, quiet power. The hardest part was maintaining the facade. I spent the week crafting the speech, selecting words that sounded like praise but, when paired with the letters, would sound like mockery. I met with Mr. Davies, the AV specialist for the gala, a nervous young man who simply followed my precise instructions for the slideshow. I emphasized the need for clarity and high resolution for the historical documents I was including. I sat through hours of silence in the library, practicing the speech, the light inflection changes, the pause before the final sentence. I needed the control of a professional orator, not the hysteria of a betrayed wife. I remember one afternoon, George walked in, beaming from a successful committee meeting. He put his hand on my shoulder, a gesture I once cherished. "You're writing the speech, aren't you, my dear? Make sure you focus on the family's enduring commitment to the community. That's what people want to hear." I looked up, meeting his eyes with a terrifying calm. "I wouldn't dream of writing about anything else, George," I replied, the double meaning hanging perfectly between us. I noticed a small tremor in his hand as he squeezed my shoulder one last time before leaving. Was he nervous? Did he sense the shift in the air? Or was he simply preoccupied with his own self-importance? I had a brief moment of doubt, was I overreacting? But then I thought of the duty line, and the doubt vanished. I chose my outfit meticulously, the sapphire blue dress. Not because it was his favorite, but because the color was cold, regal, and demanding of attention. I had to look like the unquestionable mistress of the house, in complete control of the narrative, not the victim. The physical toll of the preparation was immense. I was barely sleeping, fueled by bitter coffee and the singular focus of the mission. My son, Thomas, called, asking if I was all right, noting that my voice sounded unusually flat. I brushed him off, citing the stress of the gala preparation. That last evening before the event, I took the original letters and placed them, along with the presentation remote, inside my small, satin clutch. As I looked at the box one last time, a tiny, almost insignificant detail caught my eye: a small, faded mark near the bottom hinge. It looked like a carved initial, an old H maybe, or a stylized M. I dismissed it quickly. The letters, the dates, and George's handwriting, which I was now too furious to objectively verify against other samples, were proof enough. The box was a symbol of his treachery, and tonight, the box would speak for me. I took a deep, steadying breath. Tomorrow, I would walk onto that stage as George's wife. I would leave it as his executioner. The game was set, the rivals were armed, and George had no idea the foundations of his world were about to crumble right before his eyes. I felt the cool, heavy weight of the satin clutch in my hand, the presentation remote and the letters nestled inside. It was a strange kind of comfort, that weight. I stood just inside the ballroom doors, the sapphire dress shimmering slightly under the chandelier light. George had his back to me, holding court near the massive ice sculpture carved to look like the neighborhood's original founders. He was luminous tonight, charming, expansive, his head thrown back in a hearty laugh as he accepted a glass of champagne. He was completely, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath his perfectly polished shoes was about to give way. I took a moment to observe the room. It wasn't just a party, it was George's kingdom. The murmuring crowd of old money, civic leaders, and influential investors were his subjects, and he, the benevolent chair, reigned over their annual ritual. Across the room, I spotted Mrs. O'Connell, her face a mask of polite anticipation, but her eyes sharp, darting toward George every few seconds. She was a coiled spring, ready to leap. I felt a fleeting, almost perverse kinship with her. She wanted his position, I wanted his downfall. For the moment, our desires aligned perfectly. I smoothed my gloves, took a breath so deep it felt like a sigh, and began my slow, deliberate approach to the head table. George turned as I reached him, his hand immediately finding my waist, the gesture proprietary and possessive. He leaned in, his smile flawless. "There you are, my lovely. Just in time. They're about to introduce me. Ready for your big moment." I returned a smile that felt brittle, like thin glass. "Ready, George. I wouldn't miss celebrating your dedication for the world." The words tasted like ash, but he merely squeezed my hand tighter, accepting them as the tribute he believed he deserved. The introduction, of course, was lavish. George, the unwavering community leader, the devoted husband, the architect of legacy. When he finally stood at the podium, basking in the sustained applause, he paused, giving the audience a moment to absorb his brilliance before he began his opening remarks. As he spoke, I caught the eye of Mr. Davies, the AV technician, perched in the dark corner booth. I gave him the tiniest nod, the signal that the show must begin with George's speech completion, but that I was next. A spike of pure adrenaline shot through me. Would George notice the O'Connells were watching him with an entirely new, calculating intensity? When it was my turn, I walked to the podium with measured steps, the spotlight blinding. I ignored the faint scent of George's cologne that lingered near the microphone, focusing only on the sea of faces beyond the lights. My voice, thankfully, was steady. I began the speech exactly as planned, praising his tireless work, his commitment, his vision for the Founders' Day spirit. The audience was placid, comfortable in the expected tradition. George, seated directly below me, was nodding along, his eyes half closed in self-satisfaction. Then came the transition. But tonight, I said, allowing a slight, sentimental catch in my voice, I want to share the true source of George's strength, the private, emotional foundations that underpin his success. I gave Mr. Davies the almost imperceptible cue with my hand. The main lights dimmed slightly, and the projector whirred to life, splashing the massive screen behind me with the first image. The first slide was a beautiful, tender portrait of George and me on our wedding day. Then, overlaying that image, appeared the first enlarged, elegant script from the cedar box. My soul belongs to you, my dear. A ripple went through the room, a confused, collective gasp. George's back stiffened. The next slide appeared quickly, a photograph of me, heavily pregnant, smiling widely at the camera, captioned, anticipating Thomas's arrival. Overlaying that image, the second, searing excerpt, Agnes is a duty, you are my delight. The things we build here are only foundations for the life we will finally have. The music, a planned sentimental score, suddenly sounded grotesque, like a soundtrack to a slow-motion disaster. George's face, moments ago flushed with pride, turned the color of parchment. He tried to rise, to speak, but the words were lodged in his throat. He looked around wildly, seeking a friendly face, but found only horrified, judging silence. The slides kept coming, a relentless barrage of intimate quotes juxtaposed with cherished family milestones, our daughter's kindergarten photo paired with a declaration of secret, enduring love. It was a public vivisection of his character, performed with the very instruments of his own making. He was trapped, paralyzed by the collective weight of his entire social circle's silent scrutiny. I kept speaking, my voice level, maintaining the tone of a sentimental wife sharing deep, personal insights. I didn't acknowledge the content on the screen. I just kept delivering the lines about commitment and history, twisting the knife further with every seemingly innocent word. The climax arrived when the final slide, a close-up of George's hand on mine during a recent anniversary party, was overlaid with the final, damning promise of eternal, secret devotion. I put the microphone down gently. I looked directly into George's wide, desperate eyes. He was mute, utterly defeated. I spoke the final, planned line, amplified by the silent microphone. These are the true foundations of our family's legacy. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. I didn't linger to watch him crumble or hear the whispers that were already beginning to rise like smoke. I simply turned and walked away from the stage, my sapphire gown sweeping the polished floor, leaving him to face the fallout alone. The ballroom was a blur of movement and sound as I reached the massive mahogany doors. People were starting to whisper loudly, some rushing to George's table, others retreating entirely. I heard one of the O'Connell children make a sharp, triumphant sound that sliced through the general clamor. I felt a small, fierce moment of satisfaction. The coup had begun. But then, just before I could step into the hallway, a hand reached out, not to stop me, but to simply offer something small and metallic. I looked up. Standing before me was an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s, impeccably dressed but with eyes that held a lifetime of quiet sorrow. I instantly recognized the gentle curve of his nose and the soft set of his jaw. He was the son of Elizabeth, the other woman. I hadn't expected him to be here. He didn't offer sympathy or condemnation. He simply held out a heavy, old-fashioned brass key attached to a worn leather tag. His voice was low, almost inaudible above the noise of the now frenzied ballroom. "My mother, she asked me to hold on to this. She told me to give it to you, Agnes, if she was ever gone and George caused you public pain." I frowned, the adrenaline suddenly replaced by a strange, cold curiosity. "What is it?" "It opens a safe deposit box," he explained, his gaze steady, entirely without malice. "It contains the documents. The original divorce papers. He intended to leave you, Agnes, decades ago, right after your daughter was born." He paused, a flicker of true sadness crossing his face. "But he was always too financially reliant on your inheritance. Too cowardly to ever go through with it. He kept them as an escape plan he was never brave enough to use. She wanted you to know that." The key felt heavy and impossibly cold in my palm. The betrayal was no longer just about love, it was about the sickening realization that I had been a financial safeguard, a gilded cage for George for 25 years. He hadn't just deceived me, he had actively used me as a crutch, staying not because of duty, but because of greed and profound fear of poverty. I managed a choked, "Thank you," before stepping out of the ballroom and into the quiet marble hallway. I didn't look back. I clutched the key and the remote, two objects representing George's public humiliation and his private cowardice. I was breathing hard now, the control finally beginning to splinter. I hurried toward the service entrance, desperate for air and silence. The public exposure was complete, but I knew the revelation of his secret cowardice was the only thing that could truly set me free. The key in my hand was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, a quiet promise of liberation delivered ironically by the son of the woman who had helped George build his parallel lie. But as I fumbled with the key to my car, a faint, almost nagging thought resurfaced, that faded initial carved on the cedar box. It didn't look like George's lettering at all. A small, irrelevant detail, I told myself firmly. The key is all that matters now. I shoved the brass key into the ignition of my sedan, but my shaking hand couldn't manage to turn it. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, the cool leather a grounding shock. The image of George's face, pale, broken, and utterly mute, was imprinted behind my eyelids. The humiliation was complete, but the feeling wasn't triumph, it was a devastating, hollow emptiness. I had dismantled my life to punish his lie, and now I had a new, heavier truth in my hand, the key to his cowardice. I forced myself to pull away from the venue, the elegant marble facade already swarming with reporters and curious neighbors. The news, fueled by the O'Connells and the hundreds of witnesses, would be everywhere by dawn. I drove toward the financial district, needing to see the truth of the safe deposit box immediately. The bank was closed, but the urgency was a physical ache. I drove around the silent city blocks until the first hint of sickly grey light appeared, marking the start of a new, irreversible day. I needed to witness the professional execution that had been set in motion. I finally returned home just after 7, pulling into the garage and listening to the muffled, furious shouting coming from George's study. He wasn't the chairman anymore, he was just a man stripped of his costume. The phone on the entryway table was ringing relentlessly, reporters, friends, committee members, but I walked past it all, numbly. I found George hunched over his massive mahogany desk, his face blotchy and his tie loose. He was yelling into his phone at Mr. O'Connell, the conversation quickly devolving into pathetic pleas and hollow threats. He slammed the phone down. The sight of me, standing in the doorway, caused him to recoil as if I were a ghost. "Agnes, you ruined me. You destroyed everything I worked for," he roared, his voice cracking. I didn't flinch. I let him vent his pure, unadulterated self-pity, the man incapable of grasping that he was the architect of his ruin. I interrupted his frantic pacing, my voice flat and calm. "It wasn't me, George. It was your fear. And your greed." I opened the safe deposit box papers, the yellowing documents whispering their decades-old secret. I spread them out across the desk, right next to the remnants of his shattered dignity. 25 years ago. You planned to leave me. But you looked at the financial columns, didn't you? You calculated the cost of losing the inheritance, And you decided I was cheaper to keep than to discard. He stared at the papers, the bold header, petition for dissolution of marriage, a monument to his failed nerve. His bravado completely evaporated. He sank into his leather chair, head in his hands. It wasn't like that, Agnes. Elizabeth, she knew I had responsibilities. The children. He tried, the excuses weak and pathetic. The children meant losing the money, George, I corrected him, holding his gaze until he finally looked away. You chose comfort over courage. That is your true legacy. That was the moment of ultimate power, seeing the decades of assumed authority crumble into genuine shame. I had already visited my lawyer while I was waiting for the bank to open. I placed the fresh annulment documents on the desk next to his ancient divorce papers. I'm done, George. I'm taking the children's trust funds out of your control, as allowed by the prenuptial agreement you conveniently ignored. I stood there, not wanting anything from him, just his complete surrender. You can keep this house. You can keep your shattered reputation. But you will be gone by the end of the day. I watched him, searching for any flicker of the charming man I had married, and found nothing but an empty, defeated shell. He didn't fight, he didn't argue. He only looked at the door, already anticipating his exit. He had lost the stage, and without an audience, he had no lines left to deliver. I walked away from the study, leaving him there with the ruins of his life spread across his desk. I began packing my personal effects, starting with the small things I had kept private: old journals, photographs of my mother, and, finally, the cedar box itself. The revenge was complete: public disgrace, professional destruction, and private knowledge of his cowardice. It was a cold, efficient victory. As I prepared to tape the box shut, the small, carved mark on the bottom hinge caught my eye again. That faded initial, it wasn't a casual scratch. It looked like an old, stylized M. My mother's name was Margaret. My father's name was David. George's name began with G. I felt a sudden, profound discomfort that was irrational, considering all the proof I had just used. I pulled out the letters, laying them on my bedspread. I wanted to verify the handwriting one last time, a final, unnecessary confirmation of George's guilt. I walked to the mahogany dresser and pulled out a photo album I hadn't looked at in years, an album dedicated to my father, full of his handwritten notes from old family trips and cards he'd sent my mother. I pulled out a postcard he'd sent us from Europe. I placed my father's familiar, elegant script next to the flowery, passionate script of the first love letter. My blood ran cold for the second, more profound time. The handwriting was identical. The passionate, eloquent love letters I had used to destroy George's life, the letters signed with a casual, single G, were not George's at all. They were my late father's. George's signature was sharp, hurried, and always ended with a flourish. This script was rounded, precise, and deliberate. My father's. I sank onto the bed, the reality of twist one hitting me with a force that made the betrayal of George feel like a gentle tap. The letters were from my father to Elizabeth, my mother's best friend. My mother, Margaret M., must have discovered the affair, hidden the box with her initial etched on it, and lived her life in silence, just as I had assumed I was doing with George. My entire revenge, the public humiliation, the political coup, the final crushing sentence, was built on a desperate, misdirected projection of my own pain onto my father's silent legacy. I hadn't exposed George's lie, I had exposed my mother's lifelong heartbreak. And in doing so, I had just irrevocably destroyed George's standing based on a betrayal that wasn't even his. He was a liar and a coward, yes, proved by the divorce papers, but he was innocent of the specific, decades-long emotional affair with Elizabeth. I staggered back into the study. George was gone. His chair was empty. He had taken his duffel bag and vanished. The only thing left on the desk were my annulment papers. I sat in his empty chair, utterly numb. I looked at the divorce papers, George's true betrayal. It was petty, financial, and small. I looked back at the letters, my father's true, passionate, life-altering betrayal. It was monumental, silent, and spanning 2 families. I had sought revenge, but I had only unearthed a deeper, generational sorrow. The true foundations of my family's legacy were not George's shame, but my mother's quiet, crushing unhappiness, hidden behind a cedar box and a faint, carved initial. I had achieved freedom, but at the cost of the ultimate, devastating knowledge that the betrayal I believed defined my marriage was, in fact, the one that had defined my mother's life. I was alone now, the executioner who had mistakenly struck the wrong target, left to reconcile 2 decades of assumed truth with a final, overwhelming lie.